Grenadier Models Inc.of Springfield, Pennsylvania produced lead miniature figures for wargames and role-playing games with fantasy, science fiction and heroic themes between 1975 and 1996. Grenadier Models Inc. is best known for their figures for TSR Inc.'s Advanced Dungeons & Dragons game, collectible Dragon of the Month and Giants Club figures, and the marketing of paint and miniature sets through traditional retail outlets. The company began as a basement enterprise, but by 1983 they had grown to a staff of 50 people and had the third highest gross sales in the expanding gaming market. Grenadier's sculptors included John Dennett, Janine Bennett, Julie Guthrie, Robert Watts, Nick Lund, Mark Copplestone, Michael Daly, Sandra Garrity, Bob Naismith, William Watt and Ian Simmons. Grenadier closed its doors in 1996, but many of their products remain in production by companies in the UK, Italy and the United States. History. The company was founded by Andrew Chernick, president and head sculptor, and Ray Rubin, vice president and head artist. Chernick and Rubin had previously partnered in Canterbury Pewter Limited, a gift market sculpting business which they had established in 1972. The duo were not new to historical miniatures. Chernick had previously sculpted for Superior Models and Rubin was a co-founder of Squadron Rubin Miniatures. Grenadier Models' first product was a line of 25mm American Revolution figures released in anticipation of the 1976 United States bicentennial. The company received its name from their first miniature, a Grenadier. In partnership with its European distributor, Grenadier formed Grenadier Models Limited UK in 1984. By 1991, the British office became the centre of the company's design and development. Grenadier Models published a product catalogue in 1978, 1979, 1982 and annually from 1985 to 1994. Separate European catalogues were published in 1985, 1994, and perhaps other years as well. Their products were discussed in the Grenadier Bulletin, a magazine which also contained games, comics, short stories, and puzzles. The Bulletin was published in several series. The first series contained issues number 1 through number 18 and were released between the fall of 1981 and late 1987. A new series of 4 editions was issued in late 1991 and early 1992 in the form of a full-color magazine. A third series, somewhat confusingly labeled Volume 2, was produced in the summer of 1993, but appears to have been terminated after a single issue. Grenadier's British offices produced a separate, international edition of the Bulletin called the British Grenadier. There were at least 13 issues and it appears to have been produced around 1988. The British offices also published a bi-monthly newsletter Warrior, the newsletter for fantasy wargamers which supported Grenadier's Fantasy Warrior game. The Warrior included 13 issues published from December 1992, January 1993 to April-May 1995. Historical Miniatures, 1975 to 1980. By the end of 1976, Grenadier had produced miniature soldiers from classical antiquity and the American Civil War, and American Old West gunfighters. Although they were primarily focused on the well-established market for historical miniatures, their early products included science fiction-themed Star Soldiers and space squadrons. Stellar Date 2998 spaceships, 25mm fantasy figures called Wizards and Warriors, a special sets line of furniture, and a small selection of 15mm fantasy figures. As the fantasy and science fiction market began to outpace historical miniatures in 1978, Grenadier released box sets containing select portions of their fantasy, spaceships, and gunslinger lines. In 1980 these boxed sets included fantasy game-oriented Dungeon Adventure and Monsters sets, a Western Gunfighters, and Space Squadron set. New figures were crafted for the Gamma World Adventure, Gamma World Denizens, Woodland Adventurers, and Tomb of Spells sets. The new lines attracted the attention of TSR, Inc., who produced the Gamma World and Dungeons & Dragons role-playing games, and began a short, but lucrative partnership between Grenadier and TSR, Inc., your D&D figure company, 1981–1982. In the fall of 1981, Grenadier Models had begun to refer to itself as your D&D figure company, and began a newsletter, the Grenadier Bulletin, to advertise its status as the official producer of miniatures for TSR, Inc.'s AD&D and Gamma World role-playing games. Its first editor, Kim Eastland, became an influential author of role-playing games and fiction published by TSR, Inc. The AD&D lines included blister packs of monsters, small box sets, and large box sets. A collateral products was action art box sets, which included paints and painting instructions and served to introduce customers to the hobby. The Gamma World role-playing game was supported by a series of blister packs, or box sets of adventurers and post-apocalyptic monsters. Grenadier also produced figures for TSR's Snit's Revenge board game. In late 1982, Grenadier Models and TSR, Inc. ended their business relationship. The point of contention was Grenadier's plans to produce figures for other game companies. Grenadier later described the separation as a bold decision, in order to provide players of all fantasy games with a broader range of quality fantasy miniatures. Since many of Chernick's sculptures predated TSR, Inc.'s artwork, Grenadier Models retained the rights to many of their sculptures and re-released choice figures in the Dragonlords, Fantasy Lords, and Action Art lines. There appear to have been continued issues with the reuse of the sculpts, which might have resembled images which TSR, Inc. considered trademarked. Parts of some sets were replaced with new sculpts. In 1982 and 1983, Grenadier conducted a Wizard's Gold contest in which they placed gold-plated castings within random boxes of figures. The box also included a certificate for a drawing. The grand prize for 1982 was a 1/2 ounce of gold for the purchaser of the box set and the store which sold it. The 1983 certificates awarded gift certificates and were placed in 6001 Dragons of the Emerald Idol and 6002 Skeleton Raiders of the Undead box sets. However, collectors have reported gold-plated figures from other contemporaneous sets. Collect and Paint, 1983 to 1990. As Grenadier parted ways with TSR, Inc., they continued to reach out to the burgeoning adventure gaming market. In 1983, they became the official producer of miniatures for Chaosium's Call of Cthulhu, and Game Designers Workshop's Traveller. In 1983, Grenadier announced an agreement to produce miniatures for FASA's Star Trek role-playing game. But the figures were produced by Ralph-Arthur Enterprises, Inc., RAFM in 1985, and Rawcliffe Pewter from 1989 to 1999. They produced the Dark Crystal Adventure Collection, which included 2 box sets containing paints and miniatures of the characters and furniture. In the December 1982 movie The Dark Crystal, other Pinnacle Products merchandise included the Paint and Collect series consisting of 2,201 dinosaurs, 2,202 fantasy lords, 2,203 fantasy monsters, and 2,204 GI Assault Team. In early 1983, Grenadier added 4 paint and play sets to coincide with Mattel's Masters of the Universe cartoon and 1 285th scale tanks and artillery for Steve Jackson Games Ogre and 1 180th scale vehicles Car Wars Autoduel games. In October 1983, Grenadier added a line of secret agents. As fantasy and science fiction gaming outpaced traditional wargames and modeling, Grenadier discontinued many of their historical period figures. Lines of 54mm scale figures featuring personages like 5401 Jesus of Nazareth, and a 77mm series of figures based on the calendar art of Boris Vallejo, were dropped in 1983. Between March 1984 and February 1985, Grenadier released 12 monthly installments in the popular Dragon of the Month series. Each box set included a variety of fantasy dragon, a jeweled base, and a portion of a map of the mystical land the dragons inhabited. Those who collected all 12 dragons were eligible to receive an additional dragon figure. Other 1984 introductions included the Masterpiece Editions 5501 War Mammoth of the Undead Legion, 5501 Death Dragon, futuristic war machines called Warbots, and miniatures for Mayfair Games' Champions. Grenadier also released 4 gaming scenarios: The Horrible Secret of Monhegan Island by Gary Pilkington for Call of Cthulhu, Cloudland by Tony Fiorito for Tunnels and Trolls or Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, Raid on Rajalapur by Gary Pilkington for Blades Mercenaries, Spies and Private Eyes, and Disappearance on Aramat by Gary Pilkington for Game Designers Workshop's Traveller. Grenadier celebrated its 10th anniversary by adding 10,000 commemorative Paladin figures to boxes of 6,007 Fantasy Lords Dungeon Raiders. The Dragon of the Month products proved very popular, and Grenadier released a second series of dragons in March 1985, a line of large humanoids which they called the Giants Club. The first installment was 3501 Fire Giant, and the Monster Manuscript, which included dungeon creatures organized in alphabetical order. Also in 1985, Grenadier released the official miniatures for ICE's Middle-earth in the world of J.R.R. Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings, a line of 15mm soldiers for Game Designers Workshop's Twilight 2000 skirmish game, which takes place in a world where the Cold War was resolved with arms. Superheroes for Hero Games Champions, Pace Setters Chill, Mayfair Games DC Heroes, and West End Games Paranoia role-playing games. Grenadier signed on Julie Guthrie in 1987 to sculpt their first signature line, Julie Guthrie's Fantasy Personalities. By 1988, Grenadier became the manufacturer of miniatures for West End Games' role-playing system, Star Wars. This miniatures series was based upon the first 3 George Lucas films, and included representations of the main characters, rebel troops, droids, villains, stormtroopers, and vehicles. In 1989, Grenadier released the first Shadowrun miniatures for FASA's role-playing game, Grenadier Models UK, 1991–1994. Grenadier Models UK Limited was created in 1984. Bob Watts approached Roger Higgins of Games of Liverpool, Grenadier's British distributor, to cast Grenadier's products for the European market. Higgins recruited his import and wholesale manager, Doug Cowie and Mal Green, to set up and run Grenadier Models UK. Casting equipment was set up above their Birkenhead offices, and they learned the trade of casting by trial and error. Public grants through the Welsh Development Agency assisted a move to northern Wales. By 1991, Grenadier had begun selling Nick Lunn's Fantasy Warriors, a game of fantasy battles, a boxed game which included 102 plastic figures sculpted by Mark Copplestone, with later additions by other sculptors. Branches of the company were established in Auckland, New Zealand and Deeside, Clwyd, Wales to support British and Australian customers, remove the costs of international shipping, and connect with Grenadier's European sculptors. The company in Wales provided a chance for Grenadier to tap into the growing market for larger-scale miniatures in which UK designers invoked styles from European fantasy and science fiction. Grenadier's office in Wales became the centre of the company's product design, and British artists Mark Copplestone, Bob Naismith, and Nick Lund became the company's chief sculptors. The Pennsylvania office provided traditional themes from fantasy and history. Andy Chernick revived his 1978 West End Gunfighters boxed set and a line of existing figures entitled Fantasy Classics, Nightmares, and the Best of Julie Guthrie boxed set. Julie Guthrie introduced the Lords of Light and Decay boxes sets, a line of fantasy personalities too, and added the cyberpunk line. Janine Bennett introduced a range of Amazons which were suitable for use with fantasy warriors. In 1992, Grenadier Models underwent a period of revitalization. The company's founders Andrew Chernick and Ray Rubin returned to their creative responsibilities. Kim Eastland returned to Grenadier Models from TSR, Inc. The return to the early structure of the company may have been prompted by the loss of their partnerships with game manufacturers. By the beginning of 1993, their license figures had dwindled to the point that they only produced Andrew Chernick and Sandra Garrity's sculptures for our Talasaurian games Cyberpunk. The resurgence of the Pennsylvania offices was short-lived, and Nick Lund's Fantasy Warriors was the centerpiece of the 1993 catalog. A similar space-themed game called Future Warriors was released later that same year. Fantasy wargamers were targeted with the Lost Lands boxed sets of 25mm scale miniatures, Fantasy Warriors artillery pieces and battlefield accessories in a 15mm Warlords line of military units. The fantasy role-playing market was addressed by Julie Guthrie's large signature series, a Fantasy Legends line consisting of existing models and new sculpts by William Watt, Sandra Garrity, and Julie Guthrie. Also in 1993, Grenadier Models released Dragonlords the game, a 6mm scale skirmish game featuring dragon riders, and 25mm plastic space marines called Space Rangers. Grenadier Models figures were initially cast in an alloy of lead and tin, but in 1993 New York legislators nearly passed a public health bill barring the use of lead in toys and games. Despite the additional cost, numerous manufacturers anticipated parental concerns, similar legislation in other states, their own workplace safety, and they began using white metal alloys. Grenadier began converting its lines to a non-lead alloy they called Luminite in the winter of 1992. The use of non-lead alloy marks a clear benchmark for dating old figures. In time, New York Governor Mario Cuomo relented to hobbyists' concerns and exempted miniatures from the state's public health law. However, Grenadier Models did not return to producing in lead. The product lines for 1994 were a mix of European and American designs. Mark Opplestone and Bob Naismith introduced new sculpts for the Fantasy Warriors game, and Nick Lund and Doug Cowie authored Fantasy Warriors Companion, an expansion of the rules. Mike Daly began a series of large-scale Master Wizards. William Watt added a Battle Giant to the Special Edition line, and a signature line of William Watt's dragons. Postscript: at Gen Con in August 1996, it was revealed that the molds and master sculpts of Grenadier Models Inc. had been purchased by Strata-Libre, their longtime distributor in Milan, Italy. The rights have since passed to Merliton SG, who continues to produce many of the figures from Grenadier's last years in business. Some of Grenadier's artists retained the right to their work. In 2001, Mega Miniatures purchased the production rights to 180 of the Julie Guthrie's Grenadier personalities. Those 180 Grenadier personalities were sold to Centre Stage Miniatures in the fall of 2012. The production of all UK-designed and sculpted miniatures are currently licensed to M4 Miniatures of Rustington, West Sussex, England by the holder of those rights. Since the sale of Grenadier Models assets, Andrew Chernick has taken his sculpting to the other extreme and now creates monumental-scale bronzes commemorating fallen soldiers. He is also available for lectures on military history and art.